Jang Son was born into a wealthy family, but a prophecy altered his future, claiming that his arrival would bring ruin to his family's business. The only solution was for him to live a humble life. Since that moment, John embraced the life of a monk and dedicated himself to martial arts, determined to defy the prophecy. The story begins in a temple engulfed in flames. The elders and disciples work desperately to put out the fire with all the resources they have. Their main focus is to ensure everyone escapes safely. At that moment, the merchant father arrives, frozen in shock at the sight of the fire's intensity. He urgently asks where his son John and his wife are. A disciple, addressing him respectfully, reassures him that everyone has been safely evacuated and no one was harmed. Relieved by the news, the merchant lets out a deep breath. Suddenly, an explosion erupts within the temple, hurling the men away. Splintered wood scatters throughout the area. The merchant watches in despair as all his efforts and belongings are destroyed. The scene shifts to a nearby shelter, where a woman is trying to comfort her son, assuring him that everything will be fine and that his father will handle it. This boy is John Guion, our protagonist. He gazes at his mother with tears in his eyes as she continues to promise that everything will be all right. The following day, we see the temple reduced to nothing but ashes. The merchant, Jong Du-yum, receives a visit from a skilled monk at his home, where they discuss the tragic event. The monk, Gyeum, has come to speak about something important. Gyeum recalls mentioning before that he possessed a small ability. Jang remembers this conversation, and the monk hesitates before discussing a prophecy he has seen. He explains that it's not good news for the child's future. Jang anxiously asks if the monk is speaking of his son, John. Gyeum confirms this, and the merchant asks, worried, whether something bad is going to happen to him. Gyeum reassures him that it's not exactly that, and Jang inquires if it concerns the family business. Gyeum sighs, and Jang demands clearer answers. Gyeum explains that the problem is not with John's life. Jang feels some relief, but Gyeum gets straight to the point and tells him that John's luck is fading. Jang is puzzled and asks for clarification. The monk goes on to explain that wealth will come to them, but it will be like pouring water into a broken jar. The jar's hole is larger than the wealth entering, meaning the fortune will inevitably dry up. The merchant, horrified, asks if John is the cause of the jar's hole. He fears that his son might be the one to bring ruin upon the family. Gyeum confirms this fear, saying that John will indeed destroy the family. Overcome with emotion, Jang begins to cry, lamenting that John is the one thing he has longed for in life. The monk interrupts his sorrowful speech, offering a solution. A spark of hope lights up in Jang's eyes. Gyeum explains that if John is entrusted to a virtuous monk and raised in simplicity, they may be able to block the hole in the jar, at least to some extent. Jang, skeptical, asks if this solution is truly possible. Gyeum reassures him and adds that he does not intend to turn John into a monk, just to shape his character. Once John reaches 18, there should no longer be any issues. Jang asks for confirmation, and the monk assures him that it is the truth. Gyeum humorously notes that it's ironic for a monk to advise against making someone a monk. Jang laughs, relieved by the monk's words. The monk assures him that he knows the perfect place to send John and will fetch him when the time comes. Jang, grateful, expresses his trust and thanks him. Gyeum responds that no thanks are necessary, as he is only acting out of kindness and would always be there to help. Afterward, the two recite some sutras together. A few days later, the monk returns to the palace. John is grabbed by several disciples and forced into a carriage, but he resists fiercely. His mother cries out, saying that John is only 8 years old, and it's unfair for him to be taken away from her. Jang tries to calm her, explaining that this is the best option for their son. Meanwhile, John continues to struggle against the men holding him. Jang reassures his wife that there is no need to worry, as Master Jaeon K. Mok himself has agreed to look after John. The wife, still anxious, expresses her concerns about Elder Mok's reputation, noting that his temperament often pushes people away. The monk stays silent, listening to their conversation, and tells the wife that she only needs to endure for 10 years, after which John will return home. In that moment, John screams for his mother and pleads with all his might. She, overwhelmed, asks him to help her, making her decision even more agonizing. As Jeon is forcibly pulled away, he clings to the carriage door. The monk watches, impressed by the boy's strength. At this moment, Jong, Jeon's father, tells his son that if he doesn't follow through with this, the entire family will be destroyed. Furthermore, they may even face divine retribution. He asks his son to understand that the family's future rests on his shoulders. For a child, this is a hard truth to accept. With tears in his eyes, John reluctantly climbs into the carriage, his heart sinking as he begins to leave the palace. Later, the monk expresses his gratitude to the family for trusting him. A few hours later, Jeon finds himself alone on a distant mountain. He wipes away his tears, feeling like a forsaken kitten. His pleas were in vain, and he now accepts the harsh reality. Noticing a ladder nearby, he sees a man standing at the top. John, resigned to his fate, mutters to himself that he now has no choice but to live with the old, thin monk for the next 10 years. Moments later, they exchange greetings, and John sits while the monk quietly attends to the garden. The boy does not look pleased. His father's words about his cursed fate and its potential to destroy the family echo in his mind. Jun feels an overwhelming sense of guilt. He doesn't want his family to suffer, especially from any divine punishment that might befall his parents. Fearing the worst, he convinces himself that he will endure these 10 years here with Monk Mok, hoping it won't be as bad as it seems. Meanwhile, the monk continues working in the garden, showing no interest in the boy. On the other hand, John, unable to contain his boredom, decides to do something. Looking around, an idea strikes him. He quickly grabs a broom and begins sweeping the fallen leaves. The monk, noticing the boy's actions, asks why he's sweeping the leaves when they will only accumulate again. Jeon simply replies that he is doing it because he wants to. The monk responds dismissively, telling him it won't make any difference and that there's no point in trying to impress him, as he has no intention of teaching him martial arts. John, finding the monk's attitude strange, immediately retorts that he isn't trying to impress him and has no interest in learning anything from him. The monk, sensing that John is just putting on an act, laughs and comments that this is typical behavior for the son of a merchant. He repeats his earlier statement that he has no plans to teach John Shaolin martial arts. This repetition only frustrates John further, and he asserts firmly that he did not come here to learn martial arts. The monk is taken aback, irritated by the boy's defiance. Mok, who has lived alone on this mountain for 30 years, dislikes interacting with people. For many years, he turned down disciples, believing them to be a nuisance and feeling unqualified to teach. This continued until just last week, when he was summoned by a senior monk. The elder monk explained that loneliness becomes unbearable as one grows older, especially without someone to talk to, and urged Mok to take in a disciple. Initially, Mok rejected the idea, insisting that he didn't want to care for a child. However, the monk insisted, saying that it was not just a request but a destiny given by Buddha. The words of the senior monk moved Mok, and he reluctantly agreed to take in John. He learned that John was the son of a wealthy merchant, and Mok concluded that this responsibility had fallen upon him because no other monk wanted to take on the boy. Now, Monk Mok looks at John and asks if he expects him to believe that he's not here to learn martial arts. With a serious tone, he questions why John is in the mountains if not for that purpose. In the end, Mok says, it doesn't matter what John claims. His parents expect him to return after having learned martial arts. After stating this, the monk turns and announces that he will teach the boy a few moves so that he can return home. John, feeling angry, shouts that he's only here because they told him he was cursed and had to spend 10 years with the monk. This catches Mok off guard. John adds that now he has no way of going back home. Mok clearly doesn't believe him, thinking that the boy has been misled. He assumes that John's parents, desperate to connect their son with Shaolin, have deceived him. At that moment, Mok hears John sobbing and tells him to wipe away his tears. He then orders the boy to go to his room and change his clothes, as his current attire is impractical. Jeon asks what the issue is, to which Mok responds that flashy clothes are an obstacle in the mountains. Jeon explains that his mother chose them because they were simple. Mok, not interested in further discussion, insists that Jeon stop arguing and go change. A few minutes later, seated at a table with leaves and some grains, Jeon, now dressed in different clothes, asks if this is the food he's supposed to eat. Mok responds calmly, explaining that in temples, the rule is to avoid using fire because food touched by fire can disturb a person's temperament. If he were to eat cooked food, he would become easily angered, and as a result, he wouldn't be able to maintain discipline. John stares at the raw food in disbelief, unable to accept that he has to eat something uncooked. On top of that, his new clothes are so coarse and uncomfortable that standing still feels like a constant struggle. At that moment, Mock announces that it's time to eat. John, feeling the weight of the situation, asks why Mock gets angry so often if he eats this food every day. The monk responds, not seeming at all angry, and asks where John got such an idea. Without missing a beat, Jian quickly replies that he's heard the monk's curses towards him, leading him to believe that Mock's anger is why he's being fed such inedible food. This irritates Mock, who is offended by the implication that his meal is inedible. For the first time, someone has dared to speak to him in this way. Initially, he suspects that John is provoking him on purpose, but as he looks into the boy's eyes and sees innocence, Mock realizes that it's simply curiosity at play. Taking a deep breath, the monk explains that there's no need to cook the food because it tastes just fine as it is. In addition, it helps save firewood. Jian remains skeptical and wonders if the monk simply doesn't cook because he's too lazy to gather wood. He offers to collect firewood himself, but insists he will only take wood already on the ground, so as not to harm any living tree in the temple. Mock, unable to contain his irritation, snaps back, explaining that just because the wood is on the ground doesn't mean it's waste. Over time, rotting wood enriches the soil and helps trees grow stronger. John, completely taken aback by this information, asks if picking up the fallen wood is like stealing food from the trees. Mock, bewildered by John's misinterpretation, can't help but shake his head. John then admits that he won't be picking up any firewood because his clothes might get ruined in the process, and he plans on wearing them for the next 10 years. Mock feels the boy is complaining about his rough clothes, and sometimes even the thought of it makes him cringe. Nevertheless, he takes another deep breath and simply tells John to eat. John obeys, asking if he can have more. Mock denies him, stating that eating too much will make him lazy, and laziness is a spiritual sin. As night falls, it seems the food doesn't sit well with John. He rushes into the forest, unable to hold back, and the sounds of his discomfort wake the monk. Mock realizes that John is throwing up everything he ate. He comments that this is likely the result of Jian never having eaten raw food before. Days later, Jian lies in bed, disoriented and miserable. He thinks to himself that 2 weeks have passed, but he still can't control his digestive system after eating such food. Wondering if he should try finding some fruit in the mountains, John suddenly hears a voice. Mock appears, asking if he's been sneaking around. John jumps in surprise. The monk notices the boy's injuries on his hand and remarks that he might end up tearing his clothes if he keeps wandering carelessly. He also points out that Jian's shoes are starting to wear out. Jian admits he went out because he was very hungry. Mock responds, saying Jian's hunger is the result of his constant wandering, not the food portions being too small. John, however, firmly believes it's the small portions that are the cause. The monk disagrees, saying that people can live well on what they're given if they believe it's enough. John lowers his head, his voice tinged with sadness, and responds that it's hard to live this way. Mock, unmoved, says it's easier to avoid sins that lead to punishment. Difficulties are part of the path, and John needs to adapt. John's heart grows heavier as he realizes that the monk has no intention of helping him. Determined not to stay hungry, John remembers Mock's earlier words about standing still to avoid hunger. He decides that from now on, he will simply sleep all day to avoid facing hunger. Later that day, Mock returns from his tasks and finds John sleeping awkwardly among the sheets. The monk shouts at him, asking why he's lying around like a spoiled child when the sun is still shining. The shout startles John, and he immediately defends himself, explaining that Mock told him not to move unnecessarily, so he figured sleeping would be the best option. Mock takes a deep breath and tells him that laziness and not moving unnecessarily are two different things. Sleeping all day and wasting food makes him no better than an animal. John doesn't appreciate the comparison and feels insulted. Mock turns on his heel, irritated, and walks away. John, still confused, wonders what he should do next. A few minutes later, Mock sits down to meditate. John, curious, sneaks a peek from inside the room, trying to observe every detail. He wonders if Mok is reciting sutras like other monks do. Putting on his shoes, John decides to approach the monk. He asks if Mok usually rings a wooden bell and reads aloud while meditating. Mok responds that there's no need for noise in the mountains. He reads with his eyes and rings the bell with his heart, which is why it's so quiet. Jian is surprised and admits he finds it strange not to hear any noise. Mok, looking at him with a smirk, asks if Jian thinks that singing aloud will help him reach enlightenment faster. John, annoyed by Mok's tone, thinks to himself that the monk is petty. He begins to suspect that Mok avoids making noise to prevent feeling hungry. Just as he's about to speak, Mok tells him to stop disturbing his meditation. John reluctantly returns to his room, frustrated. No matter what he says, he always ends up being scolded. Suddenly, an idea sparks in John's mind. He thinks that if he imitates everything the monk does, he might learn something. Perhaps by copying Mok's movements, he can find a way to avoid hunger, just like the monk does. The next morning, the disciples wake up before dawn, clean the temple, and organize everything. Mok gets up and immediately arranges his blankets. John watches, shocked, thinking it's magic. Mok looks at him and comments that if he woke up early, he shouldn't be lying down like a lazy person. Afterward, Mok leaves and John quickly arranges his sheets, trying to imitate the monk, but only making a mess. He abandons the attempt, leaving the sheets in a heap. John starts following Mok secretly, hiding behind trees to avoid being seen. As he watches the monk climb rocks effortlessly, he's filled with awe. He wonders how Mok seems to float lightly, seemingly defying gravity. The technique Mok uses is called Shaolin, and John becomes determined to learn it, even if it means following Mok's every move in secret. As Mok meditates, John mimics his actions behind a tree, trying to replicate every motion. Meanwhile, other monks at different temples are also waking up before dawn, beginning their meditations. Several hours pass, and by morning, John is still at it, mimicking Mok. Frustrated, he mutters to himself about how long it's taking. The boy realizes that the old man shows up at this place every morning just to take a nap. Just then, John's stomach betrays him with a loud growl, instantly exposing his presence. Mok, unimpressed, tells him that if he plans on tailing someone, he should at least do it quietly. Embarrassed, John replies that it's not his fault, he's simply starving. The monk exhales sharply, irritated, remarking that even finding peace for meditation is a challenge. John then notices something white drifting from the monk's mouth and straight into his nose. Curious, he immediately asks what it is. Mok suppresses his frustration, reminding himself that, in the end, this is just a kid, a naturally inquisitive one, like all children his age. He hesitates, wondering whether he should even bother explaining this to someone who isn't his disciple. However, John's innocent gaze somehow softens him, and he ultimately decides to give a brief explanation. After all, this technique isn't exactly a secret. While John eagerly waits, Mok finally answers. He tells him that the method he's practicing is an advanced internal energy technique known as Yingjing, and the mist-like substance John saw is called Qi. John reacts with amazement, but Mok elaborates further, explaining that Qi energy is present throughout the universe. By absorbing it into one's body, a person can lead a healthier life. John is immediately fascinated. That's why the old man never seems hungry. He has been quietly absorbing Qi energy all along. Mok goes on to explain that by practicing this technique daily, a person can store and circulate Qi throughout their body, eventually forming what martial artists refer to as internal energy. John is thrilled by this revelation. To him, it sounds far more convenient than constantly having to eat just to keep hunger at bay. A new determination takes root in his mind. He must secretly master this ability. At that moment, the monk gestures for John to remain beside him while he trains, instructing him not to interfere. John nods in agreement and takes cover behind a tree. Mok glances at him, unsure if the boy has truly lost interest. He muses that if John were to ask a more thoughtful question, he might have considered teaching him something more advanced. But for now, it seems the boy is content simply watching. With that, Mok resumes his practice while John quietly observes, attempting to learn by imitation. As time passes and the first rays of sunlight stretch across the sky, Mock decides that today's training session is over. Rising to his feet, he turns to find John still in place. To his astonishment, the boy has been sitting in the lotus position, a posture difficult even for novice monks. Even more impressive, he has maintained it for 2 hours straight. Mock notes how intensely focused John appears. Soon, they begin their walk back home. John, however, can barely move, grumbling about how much his legs hurt. He finds it impossible to believe that the old man, who went through the same routine, remains completely unfazed. In fact, Mock moves so lightly that he appears to be floating. A sudden thought crosses John's mind and he shivers. Could the bald man actually be a ghost? Before he can dwell on it further, Mock interrupts his thoughts, instructing him to pick up the pace. John complies, but his attention is drawn once again to the monk's effortless movements, his arms relaxed, his footsteps light. The boy comes to an amusing conclusion. Perhaps Mock moves this way as a means to suppress his hunger. When they finally arrive home, they sit down to eat. John quietly acknowledges that today was a great opportunity to gather information. Now that he's paying closer attention, he realizes something strange. Mock never wastes a single movement in his daily actions. Every gesture is calculated and efficient, a stark contrast to the bustling and often clumsy servants John remembers from his own home. His thoughts are abruptly cut off when Mock scolds him for being distracted instead of focusing on his meal. Jolted, John quickly resumes eating. Mock, on the other hand, finds himself perplexed. Today, John followed him from sunrise, mirroring his every action like a shadow. After finishing their meal, they sit together at the study table. The air feels heavier than usual, making John wonder what the old man is thinking. After a moment of silence, Mock speaks up, mentioning that the book John has been reading contains fundamental teachings and responsibilities of monks. He points out that, for an 8-year-old, such text would be extremely difficult to grasp. John immediately agrees. The scriptures are indeed a challenge for him. In response, Mock reassures him that there's no need to struggle. After all, John is not a disciple of Buddha and has no obligation to learn these things. John simply nods in understanding. Observing him, Mock acknowledges that the boy always responds with clarity and certainty. He briefly considers the idea of getting John something more appropriate for his age, perhaps to make him feel more included. But then he shakes his head. Why should he do that? Eventually, the boy will grow tired and give up reading on his own. At that moment, John stands up and heads toward the bookshelf, still grumbling about how numb his legs are. But at least he's no longer hungry. Suddenly, a noise from outside catches his attention, and he turns to ask what Mock is doing. The monk is outside, going through his daily exercises. Without hesitation, John begins copying his movements. Mock watches, baffled. Is this kid planning to mimic him all day just because he has nothing better to do? Intrigued, the monk makes a decision. He'll deliberately increase the difficulty and see just how long John can keep up. John struggles to maintain his balance as he mimics the master's movements. The slow pace throws him off, and on his first attempt he stumbles and falls. Watching from nearby, Mock smirks, unsurprised. He had anticipated this failure. After all, blindly copying a technique without a proper foundation is pointless. Without stopping, the monk continues his exercise while John remains on the ground. He advises the boy to focus on learning the basics before trying to imitate advanced training. Frustrated, John gets back on his feet and argues, reminding Mock that he had previously warned against unnecessary movement to conserve energy and avoid hunger. The monk, unbothered, explains that this particular exercise is designed to strengthen the body and improve the flow of energy. John complains again, saying he finds it impossible to follow along because the movements are unbearably slow. Mock observes John's determination with some admiration, but his stance remains firm. He will not teach the boy Shaolin or martial arts. He clarifies the purpose of slow movement. It is about sharpening concentration and becoming more aware of the body's internal workings. Moving at a deliberate pace allows one to perceive subtle details within. John, skeptical, asks if it's really possible to see inside the body. Mock responds affirmatively, explaining that by taking a single step, one can feel the activation of different muscles, sense the movement of the arms, and notice each breath. Over time, with practice, Even the slightest sensations, down to the hairs on one's body, can be understood. John remains unconvinced, unable to grasp why such awareness would be useful. Mok exhales, wondering if he will have to simplify things further. He decides to break it down, explaining that the human body consists of hundreds of bones, countless blood vessels and muscles, and 8 extraordinary meridians that serve as conduits for vital energy. All these elements are interconnected. To emphasize his point, he places a hand on his stomach, remarking that this is why hunger is so persistent. He quickly realizes that John will always find a way to bring every discussion back to food. Turning away, he advises the boy to eliminate unnecessary effort and focus energy where it matters most. John suddenly freezes. A memory flashes in his mind. His father always spoke of achieving maximum results with minimal effort. Everything clicks into place. This cannot be mere coincidence. Determined, John tells Mok that he will give it his all. The monk, taken aback, did not expect such a response. With a hint of amusement, he mutters that if John continues like this, he might just end up teaching him a few martial arts techniques in secret before sending him away. The scene transitions to the main hall of the Shaolin Temple. An elder flips through a ledger, frowning. He notes that food supplies seem to have dwindled compared to the previous year. Another monk, standing beside him, nods in agreement as he shuts the storage room door. He mentions that there have been rumors of an increase in pilgrims this summer, yet donations have remained scarce. While they are still expecting contributions from disciples outside the temple, he doubts they will be sufficient. It seems that hardship is affecting everyone. Additionally, expenses in other areas have risen more than expected. With a sigh, the man remarks that the coming year will likely be even more challenging. The elders exchange uneasy glances. None of them have seen shortages like this before. It feels as though their resources are slipping through cracks they cannot mend. Winter arrives bringing heavy snowfall, but Monk Mok maintains his usual routine. Meanwhile, John buries himself under layers of blankets, shivering. He grumbles about the cold, recalling how his home was always kept warm, unlike here, where the monk refuses to allow fire for heating. Despite his discomfort, John chooses to remain silent rather than complain. Mok, on the other hand, is mildly surprised. He had expected the boy to beg for permission to go to the temple for warmth, but John says nothing. Still, the monk knows this situation cannot continue. John's body is not accustomed to such harsh temperatures, and if he falls seriously ill, the consequences could be severe. The thought of a famous merchant's son perishing under his watch is troubling. His reputation would never recover. Reluctantly, Mok decides to check whether the stove is still operational. As John lies curled up, he silently reminds himself that he must not become a burden to his mother. A short while later, warmth fills the room as the fireplace is lit. Mok, though relieved, grumbles inwardly about being put in charge of a child, especially given his dislike for dealing with people. At that moment, John's condition worsens. He trembles under his blankets, his cough growing more violent despite the warmth. Mok presses a hand to his forehead, finding it hot with fever. The monk frowns. This is unusual. Even with a heated room, John's symptoms are only escalating. He debates fetching medicine from the main hall but hesitates. If the other monks ask why he had not properly cared for the boy earlier, it could raise unwanted questions. Uncertain of what to do, he lingers, never having dealt with such a situation before. John's coughing intensifies, his breath ragged and weak. Seeing no other option, Mok removes his upper robe and instructs John to sit up slightly. The boy complies, though his body looks drained of strength. The monk makes a difficult decision. He will transfer his own internal energy to heal John. This method comes at a great cost. Years of his own cultivation could be undone, but letting the boy suffer is not an option. With a resolute expression, Mok places his hand against John's back and begins the transfer. A radiant glow engulfs John's entire body as the monk struggles to channel the energy into him. The boy's meridians are undeveloped due to his lack of experience with internal techniques, making the transfer difficult. However, the monk has no other choice but to force the process. As John absorbs the energy, his body undergoes a transformation equivalent to a decade of dedicated training in Jing. It is as though he has consumed an elixir of immortality. All of a sudden, an overwhelming force builds inside him, causing John to cry out in pain. Mock realizes that this forced transfer might make it more challenging for John to grasp other energy techniques in the future, and we'll see it in the next episode. Remember to subscribe and leave a like.